At the National Shrine in Washington, D.C., the dome above the high altar is stunning. It is a magnificent mosaic of Pentecost. In the lower center are Mary and several disciples representing the community on the day of Pentecost, with additional figures scattered around the perimeter. It was an event that celebrated the falling of tongues of flame, and it is that image that captures my imagination. Flame after flame is falling from above. Many, many more flames than are the figures below. The mosaic witnesses to the abundance of the Spirit, God's generosity showering divine life and love. I think this image helps us to enter into an understanding of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which we have been celebrating this month. Mary's Immaculate Conception reflects the generosity of God to all creation. Now, most of my life, I have thought of today's feast as highlighting Mary's uniqueness. As a child, I was taught that this feast celebrated the unique privilege God bestowed upon Mary because of her future role as the mother of Jesus, period. As a good Catholic boy with a mother who was devoted to Mary, I had no difficulty accepting that God would do this. I mean, there was a logic in thinking that the sinless one would come forth from a sinless mother, thereby necessitating that from the first moment of her conception, Mary was free of all stain of original sin. And so as a child, I joined in praising God for this special gift to Mary. After all, she was God's mother. Only later did I begin to appreciate how it could put a divide between her and us. Perhaps it started with the woman who said to me one Mother's Day as she was going into church, "I hope you're not going to preach about Mary today. She makes most of us feel so guilty. She never yelled at her child or lost her temper or did anything that was other than perfect. How could she, being preserved from sin?" I think that for many people, the feast seemed to separate, even isolate Mary from them, because it emphasized how different she was from the rest of us. Which brings me back to that wonderful mosaic in the National Shrine in Washington, D.C. I think that this feast is to touch our lives as more than just an invitation to spiritually gaze at what God has done for, in, and through Mary. Then it will do so only when it serves to remind us that God's grace, given to Mary so that she might fulfill her role in the divine plan, has also been given to each of us for exactly the same reason. This does not diminish what God has done for Mary, but it also does not diminish what God has done for each of us. In both instances, God has acted for our salvation through Jesus, Lord and Messiah. God rains down the Spirit on all, but the Spirit enters and shapes the life of each of us differently. God's plan for Mary was very unique, but God also has plans for us. God gives to each of us the beginning we were born into, and there isn't much we can do about that. But also God traces the plan of every life in divine wisdom and redemptive love. As St. Paul in his letter to the Ephesians writes, God chose us in Christ before the world began to be holy and blameless, to be full of love. Likewise, God predestined us through Jesus Christ to be his adopted children. The grace that rained down on Mary at the moment of her conception has fallen upon us in our day. The readings of the feast also remind us of something else equally important. In the beginning of the book of Genesis, we see God gave us freedom. Now, we might think of the God of Genesis as one who only forbids. Don't eat from that tree. If you do, you will die. But before God was the God of prohibition, God was the God of the call and the God of permission. And God called Abraham and Eve into life, then called them to care for the garden. God permitted them to eat from all the trees in the garden except one. There's the prohibition. You can eat from all the trees but one. God left them in freedom, and in that freedom, they chose what looked like autonomy. They wanted to know like God, to know good and evil. And what did they come to know? All they found out was that they were naked. God invited them to live on God's terms, in their freedom. Adam and Eve said no. They wanted life on their terms, independent of God. A second beginning happened in Nazareth. Again, God took the initiative. This time an invitation to a young woman named Mary, human like us. God invited her into the divine plan. Then God waited. God waited on a human response. God paused, and all of creation was still. And Mary pondered. It must have been the most dramatic pause in the history of the world. Mary began creation again when she freely said, yes. The Feast of the Immaculate Conception invites us to ponder the mystery of God's grace and our freedom. The Spirit continues to rain down all around us, but we can walk between the drops. God waits on us each day, and so does our world, waiting on our choice to be bearers of light or bearers of darkness. God pauses and waits. God waits for our yes today. May today's yes spring forth from the depths of our hearts.